Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story.
Morning, it's Wednesday. I want to start the video by saying I apologize for missing this birthday. It was on the calendar, I just didn't look that far ahead when we did our Wayback Wednesday last week. So we're getting it this week, a little bit late, but we're getting it. That's the important part, right? I've chosen horses for the race in honor of the Army, because I think cavalry would be part of the Army. They're land-based, so I'm going to go with that. If I'm wrong, well, I apologize, I know nothing, and I'm making it up as I go. So, are you ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friends. Let's see who it is today, okay? Hang on. Okay, start. Or not. Start. Come on. There we go. Okay. We got Supercalifragilistic, we got She Stole, we got Right, we got Nikki and Happy, we got Really Haunted, we got Wit, we got Lynn, we got Luscious, we got Alice, we got Eddie, we got Jarek, we got Cruising Nuts, 755, Distracted, CNC, Amanda, Martin, Melinda, Praying, Goat, Lainey, Misty, let's see here, who else? Carnival, Baked, Visiting, M and J, let's see, Tay Eats, Contact, Miss T, Donna, there's Hillbillies, there's TNT, Rubies, Handicapped, oh, it's going to be Handicapped. Alright, this is Handicapped Traveler. We do a variety of things, mostly visiting various areas and visiting, viewing from a handicapped person's perspective. So we've got some travel, we got some shorts, which is always nice, and lives of connecting and hanging out. So yeah, a lot of their videos are them getting out or in their garden. So that's perspective to check out. Like, share, comment, and have a good day. Alright, I extend my apologies to all the peoples. We forgot a military birthday because I put it on the calendar and then didn't look that far ahead.
So we got two things that happened in June on the 14th. The first one is basically you would call it when they formed the First Army back in the 14th of June in 1775. And it was from the roots at the Continental Army that was basically formed to fight the British during the American Revolutionary War. Army, oldest branch of the U.S. military. I mean, whenever they talk about, invading something or attacking or holding terrain, the Army is usually the guys that get saddled with that duty. Even after the Revolutionary War, Congress liked the idea so much that they created the United States Army on the 3rd of June in 1784 to replace the disbanded Continental Army. And the Army still considers itself a continuation of that Continental Army, thus considers the institutional inception to be the origin of that armed force in 1775. Now, that's 249 years ago, almost 250. Size right now has it just a shade over 452,000 active duty personnel. 325,000 Army National Guard personnel, 177,000 Army Reserve, and a total of just a little over 1 million total uniformed personnel as of July 31st, 2023. They also kick in 330,000 civilian personnel and 4,406 crewed aircraft.
Nobody belongs to the military.
No.
Army.
Motto, this will defend. March of the Army goes rolling along. The mascot, the Army Mules. And they basically have your Commander-in-Chief, Joe Biden, Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, Secretary of the Army, Christine Wormuth, Chief of Staff, General Randy A. George, Vice Chief of Staff, General James J. Mingus, and Sergeant Major of the Army, SMA Michael R. Weaver. Now, the Army is a uniformed service of the United States, part of the Department of the Army, which is one of 3 military departments in the Department of Defense. The U.S. Army is headed by a civilian senior appointed civil servant, the Secretary of the Army, or SAC Army, and the Chief Military Officer, the Chief of Staff of the Army, CSA, who also is a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's the largest military branch, and in the fiscal year 2022, the projected end strength for the regular Army was just shy of 481,000 soldiers. The Army National Guard had 336,000, and the U.S. Army Reserve had 188,703 soldiers. Combined, just a little over 1 million soldiers. Now, as a branch of the armed forces, the mission of the U.S. Army is to fight and win for our nation's wars by providing prompt, sustained land dominance across the full range of military operations, the spectrum of conflict, in support of combatant commanders. This branch participates in conflicts worldwide and is a major ground-based offensive and defensive force of the United States of America. Now, United States Army Services, as the land-based branch of the U.S. Armed Forces, defines the purpose of the Army as preserving the peace and security and providing for the defense of the United States, the Commonwealth and possessions in any areas occupied by the United States, supporting the national policies, implementing the national objectives, overcoming any nations responsible for aggressive acts that imperil the peace and security of the United States. In 2018, the Army Strategy 2018 articulated an 8-point addendum to the Army Vision for 2028. While the Army mission remains constant, the Army Strategy builds upon the Army's brigade modernization by adding focus to corps and division-level echelons. The Army Futures Command oversees reform geared towards conventional warfare. The Army's current reorganization plan is to be completed by 2028. The Army's 5 core competencies are prompt and sustained land combat, combined arms operations to include combined arms maneuver and wide area security, armored and mechanized operations, and airborne and air assault operations, special joint forces to set and sustain the theater for the joint force, and to integrate national, multinational, and joint power on land. Now again, the origins came back, during the Second Continental Congress as the Unified Army for the colonies to fight Great Britain, with George Washington appointed as its commander. The Army was initially led by men who had served in the British Army or colonial militias, and who brought much of the British military heritage with them. Now, as the Revolutionary War progressed, French aid, resources, and military thinking helped shape this new army. A number of European soldiers who came on their own to help, such as Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, who taught Prussian arming tactics and organizational skills. Now, the Army fought numerous pitched battles and sometimes used Fabian strategy and hit-and-run tactics in the South in 1780 and 1781. Under Major General Nathanael Greene, it hit where the British were weakest to wear down their forces. Washington led victories against the British at Trenton and Princeton, but lost a series of battles in the New York and New Jersey campaign in 1776 and the Philadelphia campaign in 1777. With a decisive victory at Yorktown and the help of the French, the Continental Army prevailed against the British. Well, after the war, the Continental Army was quickly given land certificates and disbanded in reflection of the Republican distrust of standing armies. State militias became the new nation's sole ground army, except for a regiment to guard the western frontier and one battery of artillery guarding West Point's arsenal. However, because of the continued conflict with Native Americans, it was soon considered necessary to field a trained standing army. The regular army was at first a very small, and after General St. Clair's defeat at the Battle of the Wabash, there were more than 800 soldiers were killed. The regular army was reorganized as the Legion of the United States, established in 1781 and renamed the United States Army in 1796. Well, in 1798, during a quasi-war with France, the U.S. Congress established a 3-year provisional army of 10,000 men, consisting of 12 regiments of infantry and 6 troops of light dragoons. In March of 1799, Congress created an eventual army of 30,000 men, consisting of 3 regiments of cavalry. Both armies existed only on paper, but equipment for 3,000 men and horses was procured and stored. Well, the War of 1812, the second and last war between the United States and Great Britain, had mixed results. The U.S. Army did not conquer Canada, but it did destroy the Native American resistance to expansion in the Old Northwest and validated its independence by stopping 2 major British invasions in 1814 and 1815. After taking control of Lake Erie in 1813, the U.S. Army seized parts of western Canada, burned York, and defeated Tecumseh, which caused his Western Confederacy to collapse. Following the U.S. victories in the Canadian province of Upper Canada, British troops who had dubbed the U.S. Army Regulars by God were able to capture and burn Washington, which was defended by militia in 1814. The regular army, however, proved they were professionally capable by defeating the British Army during the invasions of Plattsburgh and Baltimore, prompting British agreement on the previous rejected terms of a status quo antebellum. Now, 2 weeks after the treaty was signed, not ratified, Andrew Jackson defeated the British in the Battle of New Orleans and the siege of Fort St. Philip with an army dominated by militia and volunteers, and became a national hero. U.S. troops and sailors captured the HMS Cyane, Levant, and Penguin in the final engagements of the war. Per the treaty, both sides, the U.S. and Great Britain, returned to the geographical status quo. Both navies kept the warships they had seized during the conflict. Now, the Army's major campaign during the Indian Wars, fought in Florida, was against the Seminoles. It took long wars, roughly about 40 years, to finally defeat the Seminoles and move them to Oklahoma. The usual strategy in Indian wars was to seize control of the Indians' winter food supply, but that was of no use in Florida, where there was no winter. The second strategy was to form alliances with other Indian tribes, but that too became useless because the Seminoles had destroyed all the other Indians when they had entered Florida in the late 18th century. Now, the U.S. Army fought and won the Mexican-American War in 1846 to 1848, which was a defining event for both countries. The U.S. victory resulted in the acquisition of territory that eventually became all or parts of the states of California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, Wyoming, and New Mexico. And then the American Civil War was the costliest war for the U.S. in terms of casualties. After most slave states located in the southern U.S. formed the Confederate States, the Confederate States Army, led by former U.S. Army officers, mobilized a large fraction of soldiers out of southern white manpower. Forces of the Union in the United States, or the North, formed the Union Army, consisting of a small body of regular Army units and a large body of volunteer units raised from every state, north and south, except South Carolina. Now, for the first 2 years, Confederate forces did well in set battles, but lost control of the border states. The Confederates had the advantage of defending a large territory in an area where disease caused twice as many deaths as combat. The Union pursued a strategy of seizing the coastline, blockading the ports, and then taking control of the river systems. By 1863, the Confederacy was being strangled. Its eastern armies fought well, but the western armies were defeated one after another until the Union forces captured New Orleans in 1862 along with the Tennessee River. In the Vicksburg campaign of 1862 to 1863, Ulysses Grant seized the Mississippi River and then cut off the Southwest. Grant took command of the Union forces in 1864, and after a series of battles with heavy casualties, he had General Robert E. Lee under siege in Richmond as General William T. Sherman captured Atlanta and marched through Georgia and the Carolinas. When the Confederate capital was abandoned in April of 1865, Lee subsequently surrendered his army at the Appomattox Courthouse, while other Confederate armies surrendered within a few months. Now, the war remains the deadliest conflict in U.S. history, resulting in the deaths of 620,000 men on both sides. Based on the census figures, that's 8% of all white males aged 13 to 43 died in the war, including 6.4% in the North and 18% in the South.
Wow.
Now, following the Civil War, the U.S. Army had its mission of containing Western tribes to Native Americans on the Indian reservations. They set up many forts, engaged in the last of the American Indian Wars, and the U.S. Army troops also occupied several southern states during the Reconstruction era. The key battles in the Spanish-American War of 1898 were fought by the Navy. Using mostly new volunteers, the U.S. forces defeated Spain in land campaigns in Cuba and played the central role in the Philippine-American War. Now, starting in 1910, the Army began acquiring fixed-wing aircraft. In 1910, during the Mexican Revolution, the Army was deployed to U.S. towns near the border to ensure the safety and lives of property. In 1916, Pancho Villa, a major rebel leader, attacked Columbus, New Mexico, prompting a U.S. intervention in Mexico until February the 7th of 1917. They fought the rebels and Mexican federal troops until 1918. Now, the United States did join World War I as an associated power in 1917 on the side of Britain, France, Russia, Italy, and other Western allies. The U.S. troops were sent to the Western Front and were involved in the last offensive that ended the war. With the armistice of November 1918, the Army once again decreased its forces. In 1939, estimates of the Army's strength ranged between 174,000 and 200,000 soldiers, smaller than that of Portugal's, which ranked 17th or 19th in the world in size. General George C. Marshall became the Army Chief of Staff in September of 1939 and set about expanding and modernizing the Army in preparation for war. Now, the Army joined World War II in December of 1941 after Pearl Harbor. Some 11 million Americans were to serve in various Army operations. On the European front, the U.S. Army troops formed a significant portion of forces that landed first in French North Africa and took Tunisia, then moved on to Sicily, and later fought in Italy. In June of 1944, landings in northern France and on the subsequent liberation of Europe led to the defeat of Nazi Germany, and millions of U.S. Army troops played a central role. In 1947, the number of soldiers in the U.S. Army had decreased from 8 million in 1945 to 684,000 soldiers, and the total number of active divisions had dropped from 89 to 12.
Wow.
Now, the leaders of the Army saw the demobilization as a success. In the Pacific War, the U.S. Army soldiers participated alongside the Marine Corps in capturing Pacific Islands from the Japanese control. Now, following the surrenders of the Axis in May with Germany and August with Japan, Army troops were deployed to Japan and Germany to occupy the two defeated nations. 2 years after World War II, the Army Air Forces would separate from the Army and become the United States Air Force in September of 1947. In 1948, the Army was desegregated by order of 9981 by President Harry S. Truman. Now, with the end of World War II, this set the stage for what was basically known as the Cold War. With the outbreak of the Korean War, concerns over the defense of Western Europe rose. Two corps, the 5th and the 7th, were reactivated under the 7th U.S. Army in 1950, and the U.S. strength in Europe rose from 1 division to 4. Hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops remained stationed in West Germany, with others in Belgium, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom, until the 1990s in the anticipation of a possible Soviet attack. And during the Cold War, U.S. troops and their allies fought communist forces in Korea and Vietnam. The Korean War began in 1950 when the Soviets walked out of a UN Security Council meeting, removing their possible veto.
Oops.
Under the United Nations umbrella, hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops fought to prevent the takeover of South Korea by North Korea and later to invade the northern nation. After repeated advances and retreats by both sides and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army entry into the war, the Korean Armistice Agreement returned the peninsula to the status quo in July of 1953. Well, the Vietnam War is often regarded as a low point for the U.S. Army due to the use of drafted personnel, the unpopularity of the war with the U.S. public, and frustrating restrictions placed on the military by U.S. political leaders. This is something I agree with. While U.S. forces had been stationed in South Vietnam since 1959 in intelligence and advertising training roles, they were not deployed in large numbers until 1965 after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. U.S. forces effectively established and maintained control of the traditional battlefield, but they struggled to counter the guerrilla hit-and-run tactics of the Communist Viet Cong and the People's Army of Vietnam forces. During the 1960s, the Department of Defense continued to scrutinize the reserve forces and questioned the number of divisions and brigades, as well as the redundancy of maintaining two reserve components, the Army National Guard and the Army Reserve. In 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara decided that the 15 combat divisions of the Army National Guard were unnecessary and cut the number to 8, but increased the number of brigades from 7 to 18, 1 airborne, 1 armored, 2 mechanized infantry, and 14 infantry. The loss of the divisions did not sit well with the states. Their objections included the inadequate maneuver element mixed for those that remained and the end of the practice of rotating divisional commands among the states that supported them. Under the proposal, the remaining division commanders were to reside in the state of the division base. However, no reduction in the total Army National Guard strength was to take place, which convinced the governors to accept this plan. The states would reorganize their forces accordingly between December 1967 and May 1st, 1968. Well, the total force policy that was adopted by the Chief of Staff of the Army General Creighton Abrams in the aftermath of the Vietnam War and involving treating the three components of the Army, the regular Army, the Army National Guard, and the Army Reserve as a single force. Abrams' intertwining of the three components of the Army effectively made extended operations impossible without the involvement of both the National Guard and the Reserve in a prominently combat support role. The Army converted into an all-volunteer force with greater emphasis on training to specific performance standards, driven by the reforms of General William E. Dupuy, the first commander of the United States Army Training and Doctrine Command. Now, following the Camp David Accords that was signed by Egypt, Israel, that was brokered by President Jimmy Carter in 1978, as part of the agreement, both the United States and Egypt agreed that there would be a joint military training led by both countries that would usually take place every 2 years. That exercise became known as Exercise Bright Star. In the 1980s, the mostly a decade of reorganization, the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 created a unified combatant commands, bringing the Army together with the other four military services under a unified, geographically organized command structure. The Army also played a role in the invasions of Grenada in 1983 and Panama in 1989. In 1989, as Germany was nearing reunification and the Cold War was coming to a close, Army leadership started to plan for a reduction in strength. By November 1989, the Pentagon briefers were laying out a plan to reduce the Army strength by 23% from 750,000 people to only 580,000.
Good, less is always good.
Oh, yeah. Well, no enemies to really fight at that time. Of course, along came 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and we got to start using our forces again because, we decided to deploy to protect Saudi Arabia. And in 1991, Operation Desert Storm commenced, and the U.S.-led coalition deployed over 500,000 troops, bulk of them U.S. Army formations to drive out the Iraqi forces. The campaign ended in total victory as the Western coalition forces routed the Iraqi army, and some of the world's largest tank battles in history were fought during the Gulf War. The Battle of Medina Ridge, the Battle of Norfolk, and the Battle of 73 Easting were the tank battles of historical significance. But it's a quick snapshot. The Army, if there's ever a problem, we're going to call in the boys in the green, and they're going to be able to do really effective work as long as we're willing to support them.
Nah.
I mean, our most critical mistake was in Vietnam. But now the other little item that wanted to throw this out here.
Don't throw things.
We like to throw things.
I did throw one of them.
You did throw one of them?
Remember?
Yes, you did. Actually, you spiked it.
It went flying through the air.
Yes, it did.
Not on purpose, but it did go flying.
It was flying. Whee!
Now, if you can just find what he was looking for.
Yeah. Just give me a moment. Cue the Sports Center theme there.
Jeopardy theme.
The Jeopardy theme.
It's whatever you put on when you wait for something, isn't it?
Exactly.
We're so
We're doing so good.
We're so smart.
Now, the big thing, and we'll go ahead and give you a little speech by our president.
Ooh, which one?
Joe Biden. Says, our flag tells America's history, the story of an ever-evolving nation. 13 colonies joining together and winning independence, forming a great union of states that has grown bigger and more just across generations. A place where everyone is entitled to certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is an emblem of our strength at home and abroad, synonymous with America as a force for good in the world. It has flown on battlefields since the Revolution, and it reminded allies and adversaries throughout the last century that the darkness of autocracy is no match for the flame of liberty. And this is from a speech last year. Now, June 14th is observed as Flag Day each year because on the June the 14th, 1777, the Second Continental Congress adopted the stars and stripes of the flag of the United States.
Whee!
The first national observance of Flag Day took place 100 years after an original resolution on June 14th, 1877. Now, President Woodrow Wilson issued a 1916 proclamation for the national observance of Flag Day on the 14th of June. Read the presidential proclamation as printed in the June 3rd, 1916 issue of the Congressional Record, and then in the 81st of Congress was signed into law by President Truman, 3rd of August, 1949. This made Flag Day a permanent observance that you can see 36 U.S.C. 110. Now, the history of the Flag Day is recorded in the Senate document, Our Flag, which briefly describes the history of the flag and sets forth the practices and observances appropriate to its display. You'll find out much more about the flag with the publication, including fun facts that the flag's proportions were designed by President Eisenhower's August 21st, 1959 executive order. A flag should not be stored wet, which can cause permanent creases. If a flagpole is 40 feet, the flag dimensions should be 6 by 10 feet. The custom of flying flags 24 hours a day over the east and west fronts of the Capitol building started during World War I. The original Star-Spangled Banner was 30 by 42 feet and was made by Mary Pickersgill in her home in Baltimore, Maryland, from 1807 to 1857. Basically, it also shows the painting of Betsy Ross doing the United States flag with George Washington and others. There's a lot of speculation that Betsy Ross actually didn't make that flag, but it's all lost to history to a lot of people. But
Yeah, my history.
Basically, it all dates back to June the 14th, and that's where they look at the Stars and the Stripes as the flag for Flag Day. But this has been the Bearded Historian. Folks, enjoy the Army, enjoy your history. We'll see you guys next week with a new topic. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.